Hello, everyone, and welcome. This is a very special occasion. It is, of course, International Women's Day, and you can see I've got my suffragettes' colours on. But it is also exactly 50 years since the college voted to admit women. And it's just coincidence it happens to be on International Women's Day, but that is an amazing coincidence, and we certainly felt it was worth celebrating. And at this point, I should thank Mark, who I can't see, Mark Goldie, who has sort of been, there he is, who has been the driving force, if you like, that we should do something. And he is the person who has produced this very wonderful leaflet of timelines, which, you know, take away and digest, as it were. We also have in the audience 4 of the fellows who were present at the momentous event. We have Archie Howie, who is, of course, still in the college, David Luscombe, Colin Myerscough, and John Killen. And I think it's really remarkable that we have these people here who remember what happened 50 years ago. And so in order to do the celebration for today, the natural thing in my series of conversations was to invite Alison Finch, who still is a fellow, an emeritus fellow for the college, but she was one of the first women elected as a fellow and joined in 1972 at the same time as the first cohort of women students came to the college. So she will be able to give us the perspective of all those years of how things have or have not changed. If you don't know Alison, she is an emeritus professor of French who's been associated with the college all those years, but not in an uninterrupted way. We might hear a little bit about her time in Oxford as well. She has acted both as Vice Master and for a term during my predecessor's stint as Master, she acted as Master when he was off on sabbatical. So she's really centrally involved with the college and will have a lot, I'm sure, of very interesting things to say. So, International Women's Day, important anniversary for the college as well. What do you think was the significance of that vote? It was the first college of any of the Oxbridge colleges to vote to admit women.
Yes, I'd just like to say that I tend to be wheeled out as Exhibit A on these occasions, but
no, you're the central exhibit. You're the only
there
exhibit.
There are other people in the audience who've got fascinating stories to tell, you know, and who were part of the first cohort of undergraduates. But anyway, so I'm here. Well, I think it was hugely significant. First of all, it righted a wrong. It began to right a wrong, and I'm sure everybody here knows this, but until 1972, there was only 1 place in 10 for women in Cambridge, only 1 place in 8, I think it was, in Oxford. And I remember when I was working for the entrance exams for Oxford and Cambridge, feeling, because I knew this, we all knew it, I'm feeling a tremendous sense of injustice that I had 10 times less chance of getting in than if I were a man. So that's the first thing. And I think that Churchill's vote 50 years ago today has fed into the nation in all sorts of ways. I mean, it got the ball rolling, and I think I know an Oxbridge degree isn't everything, and nor should it be, but I think the fact that so many more women were able to graduate with Oxbridge degrees as a result of that first move by Churchill, if I can put it that way, really has had an impact on the nation. You know, we see more women in the judiciary, in Parliament, in the media, in all sorts of areas. And I also feel that something which perhaps wasn't completely predictable, but it generally made admissions more egalitarian, more meritocratic. I'm using that word in its positive sense. I know yes. Some people don't like it, but and this only really hit me when actually I was in Oxford, and as chair of the sub-faculty, I don't flatter myself that it was because of me, but as chair of the sub-faculty, I was invited to Eton to judge a prize in French, the Queen's Prize for French it was called. So, you know, my first instinct was to say no. The radical in me thought, you know, blow them. But then I thought, I'm never going to get another chance to see inside Eton. So I went, and it was a 2-day affair, and on the first evening, I had dinner with the masters, because it was all masters, of course. And they said to me in a rather elegiac tone, we can't get our boys into Cambridge anymore, and we can hardly get them into Oxford. And so So I pretended to look sad myself, and I said, well, you know, no admissions tutor, no director of studies is going to refuse to admit a pupil that they think they'll find it interesting to teach. But if you've got 2 applicants on a borderline and one of them has had the best teaching, I didn't say the best teaching money can buy, I thought that would be tactless. So I said the best teaching in the country. And the other one has come from a perhaps underachieving state school. Obviously, you're going to admit the state school pupil because you'll deduce that they have more potential. So the striking thing was that the masters didn't try to argue with me, you know, they just looked rueful again. And it hit me then that this is why you no longer have you no longer have aristocrats coming to Oxbridge as of right. I mean, Prince Charles was an undergraduate here when I was an undergraduate, but his son, William, went to St Andrews. You know, they know that they can't just walk in. So I think, yes, it's made a difference all round. And I also think that, you know, we now give very few thirds and 2/2s, and people talk about grade inflation. And I think there is a bit of that. But I think also we're no longer admitting that long tail of perhaps not so bright chaps who got in because, you know, it was their father's college or they were good at sport or their school had a closed scholarship. So anyway, yes, I think it was hugely significant. And I think we can be proud of it, actually. I mean, something that strikes me is that very few people know that Churchill was actually the first college to take the vote. I mean, my son and daughter both came to Cambridge, and they and their friends didn't know until I told them. You know, they knew Churchill was...
I suspect I hadn't, because, of course, I came up in 1971, a bit after you, and I knew that the college, you know, there were these 3 colleges that were going to admit women, and I was a year too early. But I don't even know that I'd really taken on board. It was King's that I knew about, and King's that if, you know... Yes, exactly. It's the sort of visible face of Cambridge.
Yes, exactly, more photogenic, yes. What? What was that?
No, well, the architects in the audience might like to disagree. Right. So you went to Girton like I did. Your family presumably encouraged this, even if they themselves had not had an Oxbridge education.
Oh, no, well, far from it. But, yes, I hope that the blurb that I wrote for this didn't make me out to be a working-class hero. I mean, I'm not, but my parents definitely were. And they both had to leave school early because they were both from poor families. And my father, in particular, who could have stayed on beyond the age of 14, which was then the statutory leaving age, chose not to because his own father was out of work. He was unemployed, and there was a family of 6 children to support. My father was the eldest. So he left school and did get a job and support. He was the breadwinner. But he was an autodidact who had a flair for maths, you know, I'll come on to that. And my mother also was from a not very well-off family, had to leave school early, but she was a passionate reader, and she even knew the rules of poetry. She astonished me sometimes, you know, the rules of scansion in poetry. She used to surprise me by coming out with them. So anyway, they met in London and both went on the crash teacher training course that was laid on after the war. And I think one of the things that struck me when I was a child was how dedicated they were to helping kids to achieve more than they had done. My father became careers master, and he was in a rough boys' secondary modern school, and he used to come home with stories of how he'd managed to persuade a particular boy not to leave at age 15, which, you know, the leaving age had gone up then, but to stay on and get qualifications. And something my mother told me, which again really stuck in my mind, was that she had a little girl in her class. She taught 5 to 7-year-olds who was apparently very clever, but had a very thick Cockney accent. She used to say heather instead of heather, feather instead of feather, and of course received pronunciation was much more important then than it is now. So my mother actually called this little girl's mother in and said, "You've got a clever little girl, but she's not going to get anywhere if you don't do something about this." So yes, so they were very encouraging and supportive of me and my brother.
And they encouraged you to aspire to Oxbridge?
Yes, I think I don't know when they realised that Oxbridge might be on the horizon, but certainly they always talked about me going to university, yeah.
And what sparked your interest in languages?
Well, yeah, shall I just tell the story about the 11 plus? Because
Oh,
that
yes,
was
yes.
in the blurb. Yes, so I went to the local primary school, and I was put up a year when I was about 8, as you were. You know, I know there were a lot of people in that situation. But just when I was coming up to the 11 plus, the local authority, the LCC, London County Council, suddenly decided that this wasn't a good idea for kids to go to secondary school a year early. And I'm sure emotionally it probably wasn't a very good idea. We were talking about this just before. But you know, it would have meant I'd have to tread water. And so my parents went up to County Hall to plead my case with the official who was in charge of all of this. And he finally agreed, but he set a very high bar, which was that I had to win a place at Christ's Hospital, which very few kids did then. And his final words to them were, "We shall see if your swan is a goose," which is, of course, very sexist, because you only say goose about women or girls, don't you? But anyway, fortunately, I did get the place, and fortunately also I didn't quite understand what was meant. I overheard my parents telling their friends this story. So I did get the place, but I didn't want to go to boarding school, and I don't think my parents wanted me to either. So I went to Blackheath High, yeah. And there I think actually, isn't there somebody from Blackheath here tonight? Mary? Yes, hello Mary, hi. Yes, so Mary may contradict all of this later, but Blackheath I found was brilliant on the art side, not so good on the science, but so I, never having formally, you know, I hadn't learned another language or been taught another language, but I found that I absolutely loved languages. And I think probably my mother had contributed, because she'd given me a book a few years earlier called The Grammatical Kittens. I don't know if anyone here has heard of it, but so these kittens absolutely adored, you know, prepositions and adverbs, and
As kittens
they were kind
do,
of well, they were
course,
kind
yes.
of cute little pedants, you know. So I loved them, and I mean, you forget about your 100 best cats on the internet, you know. This was nothing on the grammatical kittens. But anyway, yes. So I took to languages and French, and then Latin and Greek, because I thought I wanted to be a classicist. And by the time
your school could teach Greek?
Oh,
That's
yes.
quite unusual.
Oh, yes. Well, I think in those days it was more usual than it is now. But anyway, by the time, you know, the sixth form was approaching, I decided I wanted to do modern languages. And again, the school brilliantly laid on a crash course for me in Russian, because in those days you couldn't do languages from scratch, you know.
Yes.
So that gave me my 2 A-levels,
Right.
A-levels in language, which
So you
meant
did
that I could...
Russian A-level in 2 years?
Yes, I did, yes.
That's impressive.
Yeah. Well, anyway, I mean, the school was terrific, you know, very supportive. So, yes, and the school also introduced me to French literature, which has been my another great love, and the thing that I've done my research on. And I think I quite early got the idea that French literature is especially playful and yet brave. You know, the writers face up to, you know, the divisions in their society. I mean, Molière wrote 2 plays which could have had him burned at the stake if he hadn't enjoyed the protection of Louis XIV. You know, Voltaire, all the Enlightenment thinkers, they also were incredibly brave. Zola at the end of the 19th century. So I get terribly annoyed when I hear, as you still sometimes do on comic shows, the implications that the French are cowardly. You know, it's like the George W. Bush.
Well, I was going to say, it's
thing.
more
You know, we won't
recent
repeat it, but actually, no. You know, they're amazing. Yes. So anyway, that was my school. Yeah.
And so that led you into coming up to Girton to read modern languages and then doing a PhD in French literature. Is that right?
Yes, that's right. And so, yes, Girton was amazingly liberating. I mean, I'd been happy at school, but it was quite a stuffy place. You know, socially it was quite stuffy. And
you didn't feel, I mean, when I went to Girton, I thought, oh gosh, another 3 years in an all-women's environment. You didn't feel that?
Well, I think that's just, you took it for granted that that's how it was going to be. No, and anyway, it was totally different. I mean, I was one of only 3 girls in my class whose parents didn't vote Conservative. But then, I came up to Girton in 1966 and Labour had just got in with a huge landslide. And I think almost all my contemporaries were on the left. And I must say a word here about Alison Fairley, who is one of my own main adult inspirations. And her brother and his wife are here tonight. Hello. I'm very touched they came. And Alison, she also was on the left, wonderfully supportive and encouraging, an incredibly good researcher and critic. And she really encouraged me to think that I could become an academic.
Maybe one difference for me was that I knew the colleges were about to go mixed, so I just missed this opportunity not to go to an all-women's college.
Yes.
Because certainly that was a very strong emotion, I remember, and I went to a different London grammar school that was considerably more left-wing than that. I don't suppose I knew anyone whose parents voted Conservative.
Oh, I see. We should have swapped.
We'll merge them, get a bit of diversity in there. Yes. So yes, you went on to do a PhD, also presumably still at Girton.
Yes, that's right, yes. So I think that, again, once I realised that I could or might do that, that was
because funding must have been challenging, wasn't it?
It wasn't too bad in those days, but I think it was taken for granted that if you got a first, which I did, you would. And I remember the grant-giving body was based in a place called Honeypot Lane, which somehow seemed very appropriate.
Was that the UGC or something? No.
It was, yes, I can't quite remember what it was called. But anyway, yes, so I got a full grant. So I'd always loved reading, and I think, when I was a kid, I could read from the age of 3, and I read everything, including the cereal packet and the daily paper. And my parents, at a certain point, realised that it wasn't a very good idea for me to read the daily paper, so they said I had to stop. And I remember throwing a tantrum, and they got me a very boring children's newspaper, which wasn't, yes, exactly.
I remember that. Yes.
Exactly, but I thought I really despised it, I suppose, because it wasn't talking about murders and the Cold War and that sort of thing. But I...
Bloodthirsty?
I know, well, no, not really. I don't think I understood it, really. I think my childhood reading was also an inspiration to me, because I know it's lamentable how many children's books still have male heroes, male animals, male insects, male trains, But I not only identified with the fictional heroines that I read about, Anne of Green Gables, Alice in Wonderland, Jo March, of course, in Little Women, who's inspired quite a lot of women, I think. But I think children have got this tremendous thing, imagination. I think I also identified with the male heroes that I read about, Richmore Crompton's anarchic William. Or if I read comics, I identified with Dennis the Menace. No comment, please. I think you can, fiction helps you break out of imaginary boundaries, and identify with a different gender, a different race, different class. Anyway, yes, so coming back to my research, so I suppose, yes, in a way that continuing the same sort of theme, I've tended to be interested in authors who challenge what we generally understand to be accepted gender characteristics. So my thesis was on Proust. And Proust, in quite a lot of his novels, shows the sheer confusion and dismay that hits people when they realise that gender characteristics don't have to be fixed. And I think some of that is actually relevant to some of this timeline that Mark has prepared for us. The almost panic and hysteria that hit the male undergraduate body at the thought that women might get full degrees. There's that famous photo of the effigy of the female
yes,
undergraduate on the bike,
bicycle.
hanged
Outside
from
the
the Senate
House.
House. And then, 20 years later, when something similar was on the cards, they mobbed Newnham, didn't
And
they?
they laid on special
Yes.
trains so they could come and vote against it. And,
Well, yes, but I think that kind of edge of hysteria at the idea that
hysteria,
gender
very
boundaries
good, yes.
might be...
No
yes,
hysteria.
Yes, so yes, quite. So I think there are things in Proust, who's a very complex psychologist, that help us understand that. And then the next author that I worked on was Stendhal, the 19th century French novelist. And I think not many people know this, but he was actually a feminist. And in 1822, way back in 1822, he wrote about women's education. He said, we have to start educating women better. And a lot of men despise women for having very trivial and circumscribed concerns. But of course they do. We haven't educated them to think differently. And in his most famous novel, Red and Black, the hero, Julien, has an affair with a married woman whose husband is an out-and-out misogynist and who declares to all and sundry that women are like machines. There's always something going wrong with them. So, of course, his wife has an affair with this much more loving man. And then the second woman that Julien has an affair with is a very bold, young, aristocratic woman who actually takes the sexual initiative and becomes pregnant by Julien, unashamedly announces this to her father, this illegitimate pregnancy. And Stendhal says, sort of tongue-in-cheek, fortunately such characters are very rare. Now, obviously he doesn't mean that. He means, I wish there were more women like this. And then, so I brought out 2 books on Stendhal, and then my next book was very relevant to our gathering here. It was called Women's Writing in 19th Century France, and I won't go on too long about this because I know we've got other things to talk about, but I'd always been struck by the fact that the reputation of 19th century women writers in both the UK and America was much higher than that of 19th century women writers in France. And, here you've got Jane Austen, Emily Bronte, George Eliot, Emily Dickinson in the States. They have always been well regarded. They're on the syllabus. Even more popularizing writers like Mary Shelley with Frankenstein, Charlotte Bronte with Jane Eyre, they also have never fallen out of favor, but it's a completely different matter if you look over the channel. I mean, there were brilliant women writers like Germaine de Stael, on whom I did that in our Time programme about 15 months ago, and George Sand, who was so well thought of at the time that George Eliot took her George from George Sand. But they just fell into disregard, they were thought to be inferior. And so anyway, I had a look at that, and I thought, well, so I discovered that actually the French women writers themselves used to look at England as a better place for women, talented women, to flourish. And also current French historians bring out that France was sort of lagging way behind in its social and legal provisions for women. I mean, I know the 19th century wasn't a good century for women anywhere, but it was worse in France than it had been in England. And so I'll tell this brief tale, not exactly a tale, but sort of a tale of 2 desks, which might sound a bit odd, and then we can move on. But so Stahl and Jane Austen were more or less contemporaries. They died in the same year. So Jane Austen got a huge amount of encouragement from her whole family, and her father bought her the famous desk on which she wrote her novels. And Stahl's father, on the other hand, hated women who wrote, and he had a sarcastic nickname for her, which was Monsieur de Saint-Écritoire, which means holy writing desk. So he's relegating her to the status of a bit of furniture, a sanctimonious bit of furniture. Yes. And I think actually that you can see it in the output of the 2 women. I mean, Stahl is a brilliant thinker, but her novels are kind of heavy and over-insistent, as if she's got to be taken seriously. whereas Jane Austen is prepared to take risks. She's ironic. She's got that confidence, which enables her to
she
do
used
that.
to have to, or she felt obliged to hide her writing if visitors came.
Yes, she did.
So,
Although,
you know, that would still have been a challenge.
Yes, it was a challenge, and of course George Eliot felt that she had to take a male name. Yeah, I mean, I'm not saying it was perfect. I'm not saying it was perfect, and of course there were misogynistic attacks on these English and American writers, but they weren't as vicious and sustained as they were in France. So I think maybe we can conclude that, you know, you can encounter sexism and condescension, as I think probably every woman in this room has. But if there is enough, yes, you can, coming from somewhere else, then it's a tipping point, you know. Anyway.
Well, maybe we should move on to...
Yes, sure, yeah.
Because it is very relevant, this idea that women don't have to be locked up in Girton where, you know, a long way away from the young gentleman. And I may say that when I was at Girton, my grandfather, who had been an undergraduate here before the First World War, came out to Girton. He said, "Do I need a chaperone?" And you think,
Did he need a chaperone?
Did he need a chaperone? You know, I'm setting foot in this all-women's college. But anyhow, Churchill.
Yes,
so
Churchill.
you came here as one of the first women, alongside the students. The vote had not been uncontested. So one of the stories I was told when I first came here as master was the story of the vote, because you know, everyone wanted to tell me that the master had voted against this, and you know, the moral was clear: this is not how to be a good master. You do not take something to a vote if you're going to lose it. I've taken that on board. But nevertheless, and he was still here when you came. So what was it like that first year?
Well, I feel, there are people in this room who've heard some of these stories. I mean, my father, when he was getting on, when they met up with friends, he used to say to them, "Now, stop me if you heard this story more than 3 times." So if there's anyone here who's heard all this more than 3 times, you know, this is the moment to check your mobiles. I won't mind. But, yes, so the master's first words to me were, "Well, Miss Fish," you know, he didn't bother to get my name right. I was against the admission of women. I thought, actually, that he did say he voted against the admission of women, but Mark thinks that maybe he wouldn't have voted being in the chair. But anyway, he certainly said, "I was against," or "I voted against."
That was the story I'd always understood, yes.
But anyway, yes, so, there were a few difficult... You know, I knew there were a few rather senior fellows who'd been against it, but I think... just knowing that such a huge majority of the fellows had been in favour of it, some of them passionately in favour of it, as I understood, that did kind of, you know, it helped me set any subsequent sexism in context, if you like. But one of the, I mean, it wasn't, you know, I haven't got a sort of Pollyanna-ish view of what it was like, but I did, you know, I felt very welcome. I felt comfortable on the whole. Now, one of the things I didn't like, and I mention this because it's relevant to a story that I hope we're going to come on to, was that there was a lot of quite uninhibited talk about women's looks. I know that was par for the course at the time, but you know, I think the effect was to convey the message, well, when all is said and done, this is the most important thing about women. And another thing which I was quite shocked by, but which again was probably par for the course, was that at the time the Cambridge rapist was on the prowl, when a lot of us women were genuinely scared. So one of the fellows who'd done the most to get the college to go co-educational was sitting opposite me at high table and looking me in the eye. He said, you know that rape is impossible because a woman with her skirt up can run faster than a man with his trousers down. Oh, what was I supposed to say to that? You know, why was he telling me?
I don't want to do the experiment. Yes, quite.
Yes. So there were things like that. And one of the engineering fellows, who's no longer with the college, but during the admissions season, he was sitting opposite me at lunch, and he said, "Oh, we were interviewing candidates this morning, and I was interviewing this young woman, or girl," he probably said, a very attractive girl, a real corker, so we're going to let her in." And I thought, You know, if I had said, I've just interviewed a very handsome young sixth former and I'm going to let him in because he's good looking, I would have been thought trivial and unprofessional.
Yes.
But anyway, you know, it was...
And did you get any sense from the students, the female students, that they felt uncomfortable? Did they come and say, Dr. Finch, you know, I don't like what so-and-so's doing?
No, they didn't actually. And I think those undergraduates that I talked to, because I gave one of the speeches for the 25th anniversary, they all said how comfortable they felt. I mean, I thought at the time that it might be because Churchill, partly because Churchill had such a high admission of state school people then, and you know, so there wasn't so much of the locker room mentality as you might have had perhaps from public school boys. But yeah, and the other thing, which again I've talked about elsewhere, is that the women never spoke at meetings. And I was put on council a couple of years after I came here, and the master, it was the same master, he said to me, I advise you not to say anything for the first year.
And
so
you stuck to that. You didn't say.
I didn't, yes, that's right.
I'm not going to be treated like that.
Yes, so there was, you know, I think there was something rather inhibiting in the atmosphere for the female, for the fellows anyway, the female fellows.
And the numbers didn't go up very fast as far as I can see.
No, it was only...
I mean, we have this brave new cohort and then not much change for a number of years.
No, that's right.
I mean, I suppose there weren't that many women in lectureship positions.
No.
I mean, when I went to Robinson in '83 as a fellow, my impression was that Jack Lewis, who was very, very supportive of women, as the warden, had sort of gone around sucking up all the female scientists he could find, which was about 5 across the entire university.
Yes, yeah. But I still think the college could probably have made a bit more of an effort.
Yes. And CTOs didn't have to be lecturers, of course.
No.
And you then were so radical as to have a baby.
I know, yes. I was the first woman fellow to have a baby. But I think, you know, thinking back to that silence of the women fellows on governing body, I think we'd obviously sort of internalised some rather negative attitude. And I think I felt a bit the same, you know, when I realised I was going to have to talk to the college at some point about the fact that I was going to have a baby. But I sort of didn't. And then one day, Colin Campbell said to me over lunch in a very kind voice, this was the senior tutor, the then senior tutor, he said, Alison, is there anything the college can do to help you? And I thought that he was implying that I wouldn't be able to cope. And so I just said rather stiffly, no thanks, it'll be fine, when actually I could have done with a bit of leeway. And then, so my first kid came along, and it was quite difficult, actually, those first few years. I mean, Malcolm was a feminist, you know, he was incredibly helpful when he was there, but he was commuting to London every day, and, you know, it was in the bad old days before the King's Cross line was electrified. So, you know, he wasn't around that much. So it was a bit stressful. And also, I think during that period, I was getting slightly fed up with the male clubability aspects of the college. I mean, again, it wasn't very pronounced, you know, I don't want to overstate it, but there was a bit of pressure to dine, you know, and I couldn't dine as much as I used to, that sort of thing. So anyway, then I asked the college for a period of leave for 4 years from 1983 to 1987. And again, I phrased it in terms of, I want this time to get on with my research. And I even phrased it that way to myself. When in fact, I knew that we'd probably be trying to have a second child during that period. But the college they were very good about that, you know, and I think they realised why I'd done it. But nobody said a thing to me. Nobody made a fuss.
That nobody said,
by the way, yes, have you, you know, we now know why you asked for 4 years leave. Well, I didn't even know myself,
or
you know.
Typical, that's what happens when we appoint a woman.
No, exactly. Nobody made a fuss.
Nobody said that, anyhow.
No. And then when I came back in 1987, I think that period, mid-80s to the mid-90s, that was a really transformative period for the college. I mean, for a start, far more women fellows were elected. You know, I think 20 were elected between 1981 and 1992. and
Mark's
more
given
after
us.
that. Yes, maybe it's in there. But when I came back, I started to get the feeling that people, particularly the more senior fellows, you know, instead of thinking, right, we've admitted women, job done, you know, they really started to think about the complexity of some of the issues that the women were facing. And so when I came back, Andrew Tristram was senior tutor, and I got the feeling he was kind of thinking a lot about these things, you know, bending over backwards to make the women fellows feel more valued, you know, which I think
And was there
possibly
any
we
sense
hadn't
that they
before.
might have a lighter teaching load for a bit or anything?
I think if any of us had asked for it, we would have got it, yes. I think there was just a new flexibility, and the next senior tutor, Jim Bennett, who I think is here tonight as well, is he? Anyway, he also, yes, hi. He also was brilliant in that respect. And then, of course, yes, this happened just after I'd gone to Oxford or at the same time, but Mark Goldie becoming Vice Master, that was 1993 to 98. He's been absolutely tireless, you know, in keeping these issues at the forefront of the college's consciousness.
And it is often so much easier for it to be the man who says you need to do something about it than for the woman who looks like it's special pleading.
Yes, well, possibly, yes, that's right. But anyway, so it had changed. And I remember when I came back in 87 as Director of Studies, I was allocated a very small room, and I think the person who'd done that, I think it was, you can't prove these things, but I asked this same rather senior fellow if I could have a filing cabinet, and he said, do you really need one? Now, I don't think he would have said that if I'd been a man, but I can't prove it. But anyway, Andrew went and had a row about the room, you know, and also he said to me, would I like to be ambassador for women in the college, which sounds a bit grandiose, but, you know, I thought, right, you know, something's changed. This is something I would like to do.
And if you were on council, you weren't told to shut up.
No, exactly,
That's real progress.
Yes, quite. Yes, I mean, that was the other thing, that when, you know, there being more women fellows, the women said more on governing body, and Julia King, who came in 1987, I think she was particularly good, you know, very fearless.
Yes.
And also, I don't want to make Paula blush, but, you know, Paula came as a senior administrator in 1988, and she was great. You know, I could feel I had more in common with her than with some of the, you know, more benighted fellows. But anyway, yes, so there was one moment at governing body which I felt was an absolute turning point in all sorts of ways. The then president of the SCR was urging the fellows to come to a Normandy-themed dinner. And he said Normandy cuisine, like its landscape, is like a luscious and well-endowed woman. And somebody, one of the women in the room, it wasn't me, began hissing. And the rest of us joined in. I don't know if any of the older fellows here remember this. But so we booed and we hissed. And I thought, this is wonderful. Yes, you know, at last... you know, the men, you know, the more benighted men can't talk as if they're only addressing the other men. You know, they can be called out if they make outrageous comments like that.
Yes, safety in numbers.
Safety in numbers, but also, I think, a growing confidence certainly helped, as I say, by the, you know, the changing attitudes of quite a lot of the men. And yes, so that I began to enjoy things in Churchill again. I think I hadn't before. And you know, we elected my dear colleague Andrew Webber in German, who's terrific. I don't know if he's here.
He's here, yes.
Oh, he is, okay.
There he is.
Well, he knows I would have said that without knowing whether he was here. So, and yes, so it was already being suggested that I could become Vice Master, and I was running the Arts JRF competition. And in the department, I initiated and saw through quite an important reform to the first year syllabus, making it more state school friendly. You know, it's something that had to be done. And yes, and if I can give myself a little pat on the back, the other language departments then followed suit, but it was me that had started it. So anyway, just when I was really, you know, settling back into life, I left. I mean, Malcolm Malcolm got the most prestigious chair of French in the country in Oxford, the Marshall Foch chair, and I felt, obviously, I couldn't ask him not to take it, you know, and he'd been commuting all those years, you know, on a daily basis, not a weekly basis, as he could have done. So I suppose I felt, in a way, it was time for me to make a sacrifice. And also, I didn't, you know, the kids were still only 9 and 13. I thought it wouldn't be terribly good for them, you know, if he suddenly wasn't around, you know, very much.
And did you get a job in Oxford?
Yes, I did. Yes, but I was very reluctant to leave. I mean, people here who were around at the time will probably remember. But I had my only Me Too moment when I was trying to get the job in Oxford. I'll perhaps talk about that later. But anyway,
I think we're going to run out of time. But.
Oh, all right. Yes, okay, I'll press on. So just very briefly, because I know people aren't here to hear about Oxford, but Oxford, well, although you can if you want. But
if you're rude about Oxford, people will probably...
A place in the Thames Valley.
Yes.
You know. I was at Merton for most of the time that I was in Oxford, and that was eye-opening in a rather unpleasant way, because I encountered a very misogynistic senior woman in Merton who used to say things that I'd never heard the most sexist man say. I mean, she would say, oh, women can't do maths, their brains aren't configured for it. And one of the maths fellows in the college was a woman. I mean, women can't do law. Well, the two law fellows were women. So I think maybe she was trying to pander to the male fellows. Yes. I just don't know what it was. Or, you know, maybe it was the Margaret Thatcher syndrome that she got there, but, you know, she wasn't going to help other women. But there were more positive things. You know, there was an MST, a Master's in Women's Studies, which there wasn't here. There are a couple of very good seminars about why women underachieve in finals, as they sometimes unfortunately do. And even in Merton, I managed to make a difference. I was the fellow who was running the whole JRF competition, arts and sciences, and Merton used to wine and dine the candidates and make that part of the final assessment. And one day after we'd wined and dined, a particularly strong-looking English candidate, a woman, you know, the comment was made, well, she came across as a bit fluffy-brained. You know? Anyway, she did get the JRF, but I then put it to the college that we ought to stop this practice, and they turned out they agreed. And I also, again, I got in some very sweeping syllabus reforms in Oxford, which were designed, you know, much more sweeping than here, designed to make the whole course very state school friendly. So, yeah, that's how I feel. But anyway, I was delighted when Malcolm got the Mastership of Christ and we came back.
Yes. And then you became the Vice Master.
Yeah. Yes. So I became the Vice Master quite soon. It was a very painful period for me personally, as you know. Malcolm became ill and died. So again, as Vice Master, I mean, it was great coming back also again because there were so many more women. I mean, the place was transformed and kind of spooling ahead a bit. In 2011, a majority of JRFs went to women, 3 out of 5, and that absolutely couldn't have happened, you know, in the first decade of the college admitting women. I mean, I could never get either a woman or a modern linguist elected to a JRF, and that's possibly because I was presenting it wrongly or they just weren't good enough, but I kind of wonder a bit. But anyway, yes, so all of that had changed. But at the same time, I felt the college wasn't in a very happy place. You know, there were lots of complaints about this and that. We were bumping along in the bottom half for exam results. And you could hear people saying, well, it doesn't really matter. This is just how it has to be. You know, we're not going to worry too much about our exam results. But I felt that was wrong, you know, because you don't want to send people out into the world of employment with a 2 or a 3. You know, it doesn't do them any good, really. unless they're exceptional in other respects. So again, I sent out a questionnaire. This was my third time. I was sort of feeling that I was an old hand. I'd done it in the French department here. I'd done it in Oxford. And I do think, actually, that I've sometimes wondered whether my liking for that tactic arose from those years when I felt I couldn't say anything, that it was very confident and vocal men who were dominating the discussion. I mean, not just here in Churchill, in the French department here, there was one male opponent of the reforms that we were trying to bring in who talked everyone down, threatened to resign, you know. Same thing in Oxford, some very vocal opponents of the reforms, but when the questionnaires came back, it turned out that they were in a minority.
So you were giving a voice to people who didn't otherwise feel they had it.
Exactly, and I think that's important, yes. One of these chaps in Oxford sent his questionnaire back completed in red ink, which I thought was a warning to me. But anyway, so we, I suppose green ink would have been worse. But anyway, yes, so it turned out that the fellows, a majority of the fellows, a very decisive majority of the fellows here, really did care about academic standards, really did want to do a lot to boost them. So we set things in motion, and the eventual result of that was the appointment of Richard, who spare his blushes, but he's more than fulfilled his remit.
Yes, and certainly we are not going along at the bottom of the pile in as far as we have details of.
No, absolutely not, or quite the reverse.
And you were also acting master for that term when David was away.
Yes.
Did you do anything radical at that point?
No, I mean, there were a couple of hot potatoes, you know, but I don't think they were any hotter because I was a woman. and I hope that, you know, seeing that a woman could be bursar, you know, Jennifer, and seeing that a woman could be acting master made the college realise that the sky wouldn't fall in if we elected a woman master.
And by then, I mean, Sandra Dawson, was she elected in the late 90s to the mastership at Sydney? I mean, she was the first woman to hold a mastership. I can't remember when. Maybe it was later than that.
Well, there were a few.
There were a few by then.
Yeah.
I mean, interestingly, I was told yesterday in Oxford it's now about half and half, which we haven't reached here on the masterships. We'll get there. Sally Davis, I'm sure, will be fairly transformative at Trinity.
Yes.
But presumably by the time both you were vice master and master, the issues about, I mean, you were the first, but presumably that wasn't a sort of overriding feeling. It was more, well, you're up for the job and you're good at it and, you know, that's great, rather than your gender was, oh, we better have a female vice master.
No, well, I hope not. I hope that wasn't,
well, you didn't get any sense of that.
No, I didn't, no.
I mean, one of the things that I found interesting coming here and realising that our percentage of female undergraduates was actually pretty dismal. So, you know, gender issues haven't vanished in that sense. So if you look forward, what do you think the future holds?
For me or for Churchill?
Well, I was thinking of Churchill. I mean, for you too. Tell us what you feel for you. But I was thinking of, well, actually the education system to some extent. Because the issues haven't vanished. Not in my subject, anyway.
No, well, I think obviously there is still an issue with STEM. You know, I think that's very sad, really, that still girls feel inhibited.
These cultural issues still lurk.
Yes, that's right. And there are these, you know, again, I'm not completely up to date with the facts and figures, but is it still the case that girls in single-sex schools are more likely to do science than in mixed schools? Yes. Well, I think that's lamentable, really.
It is. And, you know, the misogynist woman you referred to in Oxford who said women can't do maths, that attitude has not completely vanished.
No, well, no. And and girls themselves. Although we do have Judy Hollier of Probert. There she is. She's a brilliant mathematician who came with the first cohort.
Well, and we absolutely know women can do maths, but that attitude is still...
It's still there,
It is there, and still there in schools.
Yes. Well, I think that's one obvious way that Churchill can move forward, you know, to try and do everything it can to encourage more women to come and do sciences and, you know, get more women generally. I mean, I think we have a lower proportion of women, don't we, because we're a largely scientific college.
Because of 70% STEM. But Richard assures me we should be able to get to 40%, so
okay,
optimistic.
Good.
And what about you? Yes. What lies ahead
Well,
for
I'm
you?
still doing...
Writing lots of books?
No, not exactly, but I am still doing research,
Yeah.
and I'm still involved in admin, actually. I'm the honorary treasurer of a big modern languages charity,
Right.
which helps young, early career researchers. But yes, so maybe I'll write that campus novel, you know.
Oh, yes.
Maybe become the Archie Howie of my generation. I can't promise to be the college poet laureate. But I was listening to a comedy show on the radio the other day, and there was an elderly comic who said he'd heard that you get more invisible as you get older, so he'd become a cat burglar. So
Brilliant.
that's one possibility.
And do you look back and think, oh, I wish I'd done something like speak up at council meetings? Or
I suppose I sometimes think that maybe I spent more time on, the time I spent on admin and getting involved in that side, it meant that I did less research. I mean, I did, I did do research, but so I suppose that might be my only regret, but I don't really regret it. I made choices, and I felt that I was able to effect some improvements. Let's put it that way.
Well, it sounds like you were. So I should probably shut up at this point and let the audience ask some questions. So we've got a bit of time for people to quiz Alison. Right? Yes? So someone will bring you a microphone.
Colin Myerscough, youngest of the four. Indeed, I cast my vote first because we voted in reverse order of seniority.
So was it a private, a secret?
No, no, it
You
was not secret, no. Well, I was firmly, not fervently, but firmly in favour. And I did recognise a couple of the arguments that were deployed against some of the time, and I think you may have touched on them. One was summed up in saying we're going to end up with 70% of men doing maths, science and engineering, and 30% of women doing other subjects. I'd be interested to know what the present situation actually is. And a second point, which I think you touched upon just now, is there was, and I'm quite clear about this, there was a fairly widespread attitude in mixed institutions that if people have boyfriends, they shouldn't do as well as their boyfriends in the examinations. Seriously, I'm not making this up.
No.
A very pernicious attitude, and there were worries that that might become more widespread. Well, hopefully it didn't. But I'd be interested to know.
Well, I thought the argument was actually that it would make the boys work harder, but I'm sure that's what I was told.
I think Richard can probably answer the question about...
But there are more women in the arts and fewer in the sciences.
There are more women in the arts. Thanks, Tim. Yeah, there are more women in the arts, but I think the real thing in the sciences is the split between what you might call the hard sciences, and I'm tempted to say the easy sciences, but I won't, the biological sciences. And that's where I think you see the complexity of the problem. We have real difficulty recruiting women in computing, in mathematics, and even in engineering, and we should be doing better in engineering in particular. But I think we are going to be 40% this year, and that will be a great point to reach.
It would be, and I think, I think the question should go to Alison rather than to Richard or me, but I think it is clear that the fact that the numbers of women were publicly, they were a matter of record and they were publicly low, that deters women from applying. So once we get to a sensible proportion, then we won't have that factor. There will still be the shortage of female comskis, but won't have the same factor. Right, more questions for Alison. Kathy?
I just wondered about your view on the role of Dick Tizard. He's always been a great hero of mine, partly because he also did the sixth form visitors scheme that I benefited from, and I don't know what you think about how he affected the entrance of women.
Again, there's somebody in the audience who can answer this question better than me. That's Mark Goldie, who's written a chapter on this whole thing. But I'll say what I understand from what I've read, and also from what I know of Dick personally. Well, yeah, I think he was absolutely tremendous. He really was instrumental in bringing that whole change about, and went about it very cleverly. And somebody has said, I don't know where Mark found this, that he set up a huge number of committees in advance of the vote being taken so that all the fellows could feel involved, but also it's been rather mischievously suggested to confuse the master, you know, who by then was Will Hawthorne, and who seemed a bit bemused by everything that was going on. But he prepared the ground extremely cleverly and wrote letters to institutions that were already mixed, asking how it had worked on the ground. But I think he was also clever in that he presented all the expedient reasons for doing it. You know, we're missing out on untapped brain power. If we don't do it first, we'll be overtaken by some of the other colleges, that sort of thing. But I think, Mark and I have had a little bit of discussion about this, actually. I think that sometimes you can present things in an expedient way when really, you know, you're actually committed to the principle of it. And I think Dick was. I think he was through and through an egalitarian, as his attitude to state school admissions showed. So yeah, Dick Tizard is definitely the hero, I think. But many others, actually, many other fellows who were on those committees, yeah.
Mark, do you want to add anything to that? Okay. You can catch him in the buttery later. Other questions?
Alison, you were asked by the master during her interlocution, where do we go from here? And I would like to take this question up and explore it, perhaps beyond the, can I call it the closed world of academia, without being too insulting. I noticed the other day in the newspaper, and I wonder if anyone else here noticed, because it was never commented on, even in that excellent newspaper that I read daily, The Guardian, that when 11 people, I think was the number, resigned from the Labour Party on one day, 4 of them were women, which seemed to me unusual. A couple of days later, when 3 people resigned from the Tory party, they were all women. And just a few days after that, when 3 people walked out of the cabinet room in Downing Street, they were identified by the journalist who was observing this as being 3 people who had turned the cabinet upside down on that particular day. 2 of the 3 were women. Now, I don't know, this seems to me an extremely extraordinary concatenation of events. And I wonder whether we're moving towards what would certainly have horrified the 19th century, which you talked about to some extent, that maybe we're going towards government by women. We've had, after all, now 2 women prime ministers, one of them more successful than the other, depending on how you measure success. And are we going down that road? If so, is this something that you would welcome? Where do you think it takes us?
Gosh, that's a big question, isn't it? I think, yes, one would need to look at the reasons why those women left. And I think in the case of the Labour Party women, it was because they felt, some of them, harassed and vilified by more men, I think. I'm not absolutely sure about this, but some of the anti-Semitism, for instance, I get the feeling that that's perpetrated by more men than women. I can't be sure about that. So I don't know. I wouldn't see those women as being in a particularly powerful position. And, you know, the Tiggers, as they're called, are not... It remains to be seen just how powerful they'll be, but we all know what the fate of small parties is with our voting system. But I don't think... I think as far as the question of, you know, what one's view would be if more women were in positions of government than men. For a start, I think we've got a long way to go, but I would regard that as absolutely fine, possibly a good thing, although I'm not...
You don't think it would change some of the values that are sort of promoted a lot of the time?
I think it might, yes. I mean, there's that Harvard academic Steven Pinker who's written The Better Angels of Our Nature, quotation from the Gettysburg Address, and he thinks that, yes, the fact that more women are in politics, in countries like Scandinavia has gradually changed aspects of the culture. One doesn't,
Yeah, because, I think there's been a lot of discussion about austerity and would it have happened in the same way, because a lot of the cuts affect women.
They affect women, but sadly it's been women also who've,
Not all the time, but yes.
Yeah, yes.
So
I think I would definitely regard it with equanimity. I mean, why is it important whether it's women or men? Yeah.
there's a question in the middle.
Thanks very much. Meredith Lloyd Evans. I left here in 1973. I have to say that the question of women in college slightly passed me by, because the college had always been rather welcoming to overnight stayers who were female. And I didn't really notice any big difference in the number of women at breakfast or at dinner. Partly also I lived out of college, so the impact would have been less. What I really wanted to ask about was, there is now a very powerful trend which has got a lot of new evidence on its side and which will generate far more analysis and studies, that there is no difference between male and female brains, which is what a lot of predication has been based on. At the same time, people who are looking at this area are seeing that one of the reasons why girls have been thought of as not very good in particular areas, or as potentially not suffering from particular diseases, is because the measurement, the analysis, and the diagnostic systems have all been developed on the basis that these are for men, and they will automatically not give a proper answer when you're looking at women. How far do you think this trend, this change, this dynamism will have a real impact on things like more girls coming into STEM, more women taking a more positive and confident role in decision-making and moving things forward?
Well, I think it certainly deserves to be better known that actually there are no differences of importance between the male and the female brain. And there's a scientist, Gina Rippon, isn't there, who's written very eloquently about that and about the plasticity of the brain, the way it forms its own, it forms pathways, depending on the kind of circumstances or environment that the possessor of that brain finds himself or herself in. Yes, and I think, isn't there some evidence that those studies which show there is no difference are actually suppressed, because it's much more exciting to hit the headlines with, men are from Mars, women are from Venus, rather than saying, well, basically, there isn't any difference. Yeah. But I think all of these things will gradually seep into public consciousness and make people more realise that their daughters, I think we were talking about this before, I think fathers with daughters suddenly think, well, hang on a minute, I've got a clever girl here, why can't she do the same as little Johnny down the road? I think it's a matter of prevailing attitudes, which are changing. I mean, I can see it really. My father would never have changed a nappy, whereas my son-in-law does it all the time. So, and also, I think, biologically, men and women have been the same since Homo sapiens, came on stage. But they're still, sorry, when I say the same, I mean women are still women, men are still men, but women can do hugely many activities that it used to be thought were impossible for them. I mean, I think just 150 years ago, if somebody had said a woman can be prime minister, they would have been greeted with disbelief. So, yeah, the sky's the limit, really.
Piers?
Wait for the microphone. John Sparrow, Warden of All Souls in Oxford, once said that anyone who got a first in grades could get up science in a fortnight. And I wonder whether you think, on the basis of your experience, that Oxford is more the home of atavistic prejudice on matters of that kind and on sex too, than Cambridge.
Well, yes, I mean, Oxford, to be fair, you know, Oxford did give women full degrees from 1920, whereas Cambridge waited till 1948. Oxford did have more female masters of colleges from quite an early stage than Cambridge. But I certainly, yes, there's a sort of, I did encounter a certain complacency and conservatism there that I haven't here, I must say. Worse than here, yes, worse than here. But that might just be, you know, people I was mixing with.
Alex got a question. Oh, it's Alec first and then you.
My wife, Mary, just told me I shouldn't ask this question. I'm going to ask it anyway. Women have come a long way in the university in their recognition in sport. I mean, women are on the Thames with the men racing now, but I observe that there's far still to go on that. Would you agree with me?
Far in what
Well, the
respect?
recognition of the importance of sport for women in the university. Or do you not think sport's important anyway? I mean, that's another issue.
Well, we'll draw a veil over that perhaps. But do women, I mean, again, you're perhaps not asking the right person, do women still only get half blues rather than full blues? Because they used to only get half blues.
I don't know.
They,
I think neither of us are very well qualified to answer that.
yes.
Maybe others who know more. But it's certainly true that the getting on the Thames on the same day is very recent, isn't it? Only about 3 years since the women's did.
It is very recent.
It is, yes, and
And
the rugby was even more recent.
It used to be said they wouldn't have a chance of doing it.
Yeah, well.
And, you know, we've seen in outside world, you know, there's totally equal attention to women tennis players as there are men.
Unequal, you're saying?
Well, the prize money hasn't quite caught up, has it?
No, it hasn't quite, no.
There was a question in front.
Hiya. Yes, women can get full blues now, which is a
thank
great
you.
thing.
Okay, thank you.
So my question was, I know you talked about reforming the syllabus to be more state school friendly. What would you say about looking at syllabuses in terms of reforming them to be more feminist or perhaps more open to authors from sort of people of colour or that kind of thing? I feel like there's still some way to go in the Cambridge system. I don't know what you would say to that in that respect.
Well, I think in my subject, at least, some of those reforms have taken place. You know, we now make sure that there are plenty of women authors available for study. We've got colonial or post-colonial papers. You know, we are looking at what went on in France's colonies, you know, setting that in context. Yes, it's got to happen. I mean, I think there's only a limited amount of time for the syllabus or syllabuses, and so if you are studying one thing, you're not going to be studying another. And there's a bit of me, you know, the old-fashioned bit or the conservative bit that thinks, well, you know, I do still want people to read those great 17th century playwrights, but I also want them to be able to study other authors, study all the new, any subject's got to be open to new developments. And I mean, we've got some very exciting things going on in the study of cinema, for example, in modern languages. So, does that answer your question? Yeah, I think we do. We've got to be flexible.
Yes, and I think some subjects are more moving more than others. Right, last question from Sally.
I'm sorry to lower the tone a bit here, but it's a trivial but linguistic question. It's just about the use of the term master.
Yes.
And it feels kind of like the elephant in the room. And I just wondered what you both thought about that.
Well, can I speak? Because I was here when, yes, again, this was in the late 80s. The women here tried to get the college to stop using the title master and to switch to a gender-neutral one. And we were outvoted. I mean, there were some men who also wanted the change. But I remember Ray Abrams, the anthropologist, he said I found it very touching. He said when this vote had been taken and lost, we men can always outvote the women. We're likely always to be in the majority, but perhaps we shouldn't have on this issue. And I'm not a great fetishist about titles and names and so on, but I have actually, and I said this to Athene before we came here, I've wondered whether entering into Oxford's greater, better record in electing female masters could possibly be the fact that they have far more gender-neutral titles in Oxford. It's warden, president, principal. There are very few masters in Oxford. I don't know. I mean, you'd have to believe that language very much shapes your perception.
Yes.
And of course, we do have female masters here. But I myself would prefer a gender-neutral
I mean,
term.
when I was elected, I was led to believe there had been a discussion a few years before, and the college being split between warden and president or something. I can't remember what the two terms were, and there was no majority for any particular gender-neutral term, and I had no desire to reopen that. I personally don't have a problem with being called master, because I think of it as an office, not a male word, if you like. And I didn't want to be a mistress. So maybe that is a good point to draw these discussions to a close. Thank you. It's been fun,
Yes,
interesting. I hope everyone else has enjoyed it as much as I have. There are now drinks in the buttery. And for those alum and fellows who are dining, they're going to gong in the buttery, so you don't have to try and fight your way over to the SCR. So they will gong in the buttery as well as in the SCR. So just make your way upstairs for dinner when they gong. Thank you hugely. It's been great. Thank you.